Good evening, everyone. Wow. My goodness, what a great crowd. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Al Akers. I am the interim director of Georgetown University Art Galleries. I am also faculty in the Department of Art and Art History. And on behalf of my colleagues in the department and my colleagues here in the galleries, we are just delighted to be able to welcome you for what promises to be a very special conversation this evening. We're especially pleased to be working with our colleagues in the Mellon Sawyer Seminar and the Center for the Study of Slavery and Its Legacies, who are co-sponsoring the event. You'll hear a little bit more about that soon. I just wanted to say a word first about where we are, what is surrounding us. This, of course, is the work of Carol Walker, as many of you will know, an internationally renowned artist whose explorations of race, of slavery, of sexuality, of hate, of violence, and much more, are really some of the most indelible work in all of contemporary art. The exhibition around us here in the Dela Cruz Gallery is called Back of Hand. You may have read a bit about it here on the wall to my left. This features new works on paper. And then across the atrium, I want to be sure people are aware of this, across the atrium in the smaller Spagnolo Gallery is another exhibition of Carol Walker's work, also new work, that is called Prince McVeigh and the Turner Blasphemies. That consists of a single piece. It is a 12-minute stop-motion film. I highly recommend you find the time, if not this evening, another time, to come back and see what that's about. I'd like to say, too, that these exhibitions were curated by Dr. Katie Giha of the University of Georgia. They were brought here to Georgetown thanks to the inspiration and the excellent work of our own Emma McMorran, standing in the back over here, our manager of exhibitions and public programs. Both exhibitions will be on view through December 3rd. As I say, I hope you'll be able to come back, spend more time with what we've got here. This is the first time any of this work has been shown in Washington, and all of it was produced either during or since the pandemic. And that, in fact, is a part of what's going on quite consciously in some of the work. Follow us on the web, on social media. There are a few more programs forthcoming, including a closing ceremony on December 3rd. That'll be a Sunday afternoon. One last chance to gather with the works. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Imani Morrison, who is Assistant Professor of African American Literature and Culture in the English Department. She is also affiliate faculty in the Department of African American Studies, also the principal investigator for this year's Mellon Sawyer Seminar on Creative Placemaking, Black Restorative Ecologies, and Black Spatial Futures, the chief sponsor of tonight's event. I will turn it over to her now to introduce the speakers. Dr. Morrison.
Good evening, everyone. I'm still like, this is real. It's super exciting to be here. Thank you all for coming out. And I want to thank you, our speakers, who I'll be introducing in a second, for sharing their invaluable research insights and perspectives with us, to the Georgetown Art Galleries, and particularly the Dela Cruz Gallery for partnering with us, as well as the Center for the Study of Slavery and Its Legacies here at Georgetown for co-sponsoring the event. We want to thank the Mellon Foundation, of course, for funding this endeavor. And I also want to extend a special thank you to our talented postdoctoral fellow, Timothy Comfort, for making this logistically possible. I want to acknowledge that this event and Georgetown University are on lands inhabited and cared for by the Piscataway and the Nacotchtank peoples. I want to also acknowledge that land acknowledgements are imperfect tools that are well-meaning, but fall far short of the honoring, acknowledgement, and reparative justice due to Indigenous peoples stewarding the land. Again, I'm Dr. Imani Morrison, and I am the lead PI for this Mellon Sawyer seminar, which will run until December 2024. Mellon Sawyer seminars are meant to be temporary research centers that take on contemporary issues grounded in comparative and historical approaches. So today's public session is our second of several, so please stay on the lookout for more to come in the coming months. So now I'll like to introduce our moderator and our speaker. Our moderator, Melanie White, Dr. Melanie White, is an assistant professor of Afro-Caribbean Studies in the Department of African American Studies in the Women and Gender Studies program at Georgetown University. She holds a PhD in Africana Studies from Brown University, and her research and teaching interests include hemispheric Black feminist politics, Black diasporic women's art, and the histories, politics, and visual cultures of Black Latin America and the Caribbean. Our esteemed speaker, Dr. Kathryn Benjamin Golden, is a professor of Africana Studies at the University of Delaware and teaches courses in early African American history, Black women's history, and slave resistance in the Atlantic world. She is currently writing a book entitled This Insurgent Ground: Black Women, Marronage, and Rebellion in the Great Dismal Swamp. Her work has been published in the Journal of African American Studies, Slavery and Abolition, The Black Scholar, and the Winterthur Portfolio. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Kathryn Benjamin Golden, and please welcome her. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I am so excited to be here and in this really appropriate space and setting for what I'm going to talk about. I'm just excited to be amidst your community here at Georgetown. I want to thank the De La Cruz Art Gallery for having me. The Mellon Sawyer Seminar, organized and facilitated by my friend and colleague, Dr. Imani Morrison. I want to thank you for your work to bring me here as well. And of course, Dr. Comfer, for your work to bring me here and work out all these logistics. And Dr. White for being in conversation with me. And I look so much forward to our dialogue today. So I'm excited to talk about Black ecologies. I'm excited to talk about Black spatialities, past, present, and future. And so I am sharing a bit of my work in progress, my book in progress, which does locate enslaved and maroon women. Yes, women maroons, who in fact have an active role in this form of overt resistance and world making, alternative world making, oppositional world making. So I find women, I find men, I find children in swamps and in woods and in bogs, in forests, in moccasins, which is another word for a marshland, a swamp. And so what I'm going to do as we are thinking about Black spatialities and geography and ecology, and for me and my work, these spatial frameworks and conversations, what's at stake for that, in that for me, is thinking about contestations of power and struggle, how these things get mapped into spaces, but also the ways that human action, human stories inscribe and are inscribed by the natural world. And so I want to bring us in, if you will, to this swamp as safely as we can, because it is a very intense place, as I was just sharing with the seminar previously. But I want to sort of bring you in here, and this is your first glimpse into this swamp. This is a 1862 illustration entitled Slave Hunt. And you can see in the background, maybe if you're in the back, that there are some bloodhounds who are chasing and pursuing these maroons here in the Dismal Swamp. And there's a shadow here to the right of patrollers and slave catchers who are very shadowy in the background. But this is a really important space, and I'm excited to talk about it today. And so what I'm going to do is talk about some of the great stories, some of the tremendous stories that come out of this swampscape, that are tied to this swampscape. And so the overall story I'm telling is one about Black world making and resistance, and how Black people give insurgent meaning to a swamp. And in this story, there are really three key actors. There are really three key forces. One, Black people, enslaved people and maroons, the maroons that they become through their own decision-making and action and placing one foot in front of the other to abscond and self-extricate. Two, white plantation society. This is the second sort of group of actors that give this swamp significance. enslavers, patrols, planters, okay, although we know that they weren't actually planting anything, but they're called planters. So militia captains, jailers, and then the third actor is this living, breathing swamp itself. Okay? And it is just that. It is living, it is breathing. So I want to think about the ways that the natural environment, the ecosystem, the ecology of the swamp is very much so a force and a character in the stories that I care about and the stories that I'm telling and beginning to narrate. And so this is really a history about Black people's liberatory relationships with land, with water, with nature, with non-human beings, with animals, with plant life, but also with other human beings in the swamps, in the woods, which are places that become natural refuges. And all of these relationships in the context of slavery are non-compliant. All of these relationships in the context of slavery are rebellious through their resourcefulness, and they are emancipatory, so they are insurgent. Okay, now I want to just give you a little glimpse of where we are talking about here. On the left, you have a map. Yes, left, you have a map that is 1890, dated 1890, so around 30 years after the end of the Civil War, right, a little less. And you can see the green space there is representative of the sprawl of this swamp. It looks a lot bigger in 1890 than it does in the 1970s map that the National Park Service put out, where you can see sort of this is the white area is the official, I guess, spatialization of or borders that are now attributed to the remaining surviving swamp. And this is almost 100 years after this other map here. So the swamp shrinks, and I'll get back to this point. But I want you to understand where we're talking about. This is the eastern seaboard straddling this coast, right, and the border between Virginia and North Carolina. You can see and recognize some of the cities that continue to be a part of the Tidewater area, as it's called, Tidewater, Virginia, and North Carolina. And thousands of maroons lived in this swampland between roughly 1680, so when the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade really is ramping up, and tobacco is begging these colonists to, or tempting them into, right, more and more increased slave trade, and there are more and more Africans there. You have this period that begins the period of Black marronage in the swamp, lasting until the end of the Civil War. So thousands of maroons lived there during this time, which is, a couple hundred years. And this space was closer to what you see on the left, a space roughly the size of the state of Delaware at about 2,000 square miles. And this is not a swamp where it's a huge body of water and that's it. This is a swamp that is forested, dense woods, thickets, and pockets of actual water interspersed in and between and bordering the developing plantation world. So I'm going to show you a few photos that I took in 2000. These ones are from 2022. This is my most recent foray into the swamp. But Black environmental knowledge, deep understanding of, and even a kind of soul or spiritual connectedness to ways out, the roads, paths, creeks, swamps, rivers, and woods. This comprised the intellectual and cultural and spiritual building blocks of an insurgent ecology. These were the natural routes and refuges that enslaved people and the maroons that they became valued as spaces of fleeting or permanent escape. So the waterways and forested swamps were opportunities to construct alternative lives of perpetual evasion and sociality, social life against captivity, exclusion, and premature death. So for people of African descent who are ensnared in this tidewater, slaveholding, and capitalist societies that were intent on rendering them expendable, laboring property or else subjects of, to quote Saidiya Hartman, two zones of death, social or corporeal, the swampscape invited insurgent imaginings and understandings of social life and possibility where it otherwise was not meant to exist. This swamp provided the means to make elsewhere not merely a state of mind, but a tangible and material space of home and belonging outside of and in conflict with the terrain of captivity. So fugitive decisions to choose life in the wilderness as opposed to lives of death in the plantation world, or coerced and forced labor and violence in the plantation world, should be interpreted as deliberate and strategic political acts in the formation of a rivaling insurgent ecology. So I'm going to take you now further into the swamp space, and you can see how thick these woods are. And in this image, you can see the reflection of water. But this is what was described as impenetrable. Of course, we know it was penetrable, as I will begin to discuss. But I want to take us a little bit further in now with more of the stories that give this space meaning. And you are now walking through the basin floor of the Great Dismal Swamp, as you can see, the basin floor. And a precious account comes in the narrative of a man known as Moses Grandy. He was an enslaved man in North Carolina, in the neighborhood of Camden County, in the North Carolina side of the Great Dismal Swamp. And he understood that this sprawl of forested swamp held resistive and emancipatory potential. In his narrative that he writes, he recalled that as a child, his mother took flight, escaped into the swampy woods that encroached on her enslaver's land. And she goes into these swamp borderlands neighboring her site of captivity, and she escapes and brings with her Moses Grandy, her son, and his young siblings. And Moses recounted, this is his childhood, and he's recounting that when he and his siblings were thirsty while lying out for a time, it's called lying out, absconding, right, truancy. But this is marronage that we're talking about. Their mother sought water in any hole or puddle formed by falling trees or otherwise. He described the water there as being often full of tadpoles and insects, to which his mother strained and gave it round to each of us in the hollow of her hand. For food, she gathered berries in the woods. She got potatoes, raw corn, etc. His words. So we're brought to imagine, as we look at the surviving swamp floor, Moses Grandy's mother providing her children with sustenance, love, and protection by way of the swamp's ecological offerings. She had also provided these children, her children, a crucial lesson. The swampland itself could be utilized to withdraw from the plantation world, just as it could be a place that through their own ingenuity could fundamentally disrupt slaveholding power and avoid capture. And this is the kind of insurgent knowledge possessed by enslaved women and men and maroons that they become, that there is an alternative. An alternative is possible. Now, enslavers unquestionably sensed that enslaved people understood the swamp differently than they did. And they feared their powerlessness in the presence of this foreboding swamp. And with frustrated pens, they noted the indestructibility of the swamp's ecology, which was an indestructibility that matched that of maroon inhabitants that were living there, moving through the space. And some of the things that colonists and enslavers wrote, I'll just give you a few examples of how frustrated they were. No condition on the earth's surface was more wild and irreclaimable than this. Others complained the swamp was dark and dreary, altogether impervious to the rays of the sun, a place where no noise, clamor, or hallooing can be heard except for the unending raucous of insects and reptiles and the constant rustling of jungle-like vegetation. For colonists and enslavers, unless tamed and controlled, this swamp space was a problem. It was repeatedly described by colonists and enslavers as dreadful, dangerous, and unsuitable for human habitation. And these latter two photos I've shown are from 2013, as I was trekking through this swamp to arrive at an archaeological dig. But the real peril of this swamp was not just how dangerous its terrain and waters were. The real problem or peril of this swamp was Black people's concealable movement in it and knowledge of such an untamable place. The real peril was the realization that these very ecological attributes that colonists and enslavers despised were especially useful for executing and devising enslaved people and the maroons they become, their safety and independent interests that worked against the exploitation of both Black people and the natural world. And moreover, what's more, to compound this, practiced and studied maroon mobility, subversive survival against bondage or death, and social life in the swamp did not only represent a loss of labor and economic power, it also directly threatened the supremacy of a very fragile and precarious white social order. So autonomous Black social life, independent, self-determined sociality could thrive in the Great Dismal Swamp. It could thrive. Maroons in the swamp, they walked, they ran, they slept, they rested, they played music, they sang, they gave birth, they buried the dead, they prayed, they laughed openly, they gardened, they hunted, they fished, they cooked, they practiced medicine. They chose their own intimate partners. And they advanced insurgent plans of rebelliousness, of revolt, outright revolt in this great morass where independent activities could happen, could be possible. Maroon women and men made use of the swamp's boggy and dense forests and low-hanging branches and vines as both a cover for bodily concealment and protection and as a source and shelter of Black sociality, forbidden community exchange and lifeways that were only possible through fugitivity. Maroon subsistence and self-sustenance was dependent on the swamp's rich wildlife, and rich it really is. It teems to this day with raccoon, deer, possum, duck, partridges, pheasant, fish, so many turtles, frogs, snakes, muskrats. Maroons raised rice, they raised grain and other vegetation natural to the swamp. They grew corn and potatoes on the drier patches, not perpetually flooded and underwater. And going back to Moses Grandy and some of the things that he reveals about the natural bounty of this swamp, he recalled a strong weed that grew throughout the swampland called the oak of Jerusalem. The oak of Jerusalem. It is used to treat fevers, and this is common knowledge amongst enslaved communities. Treat fevers, intestinal worms, and muscle spasms. It is found wild in the Great Dismal Swamp, in and around. There are a number of berries and roots and barks that are present in the swamp that could be used to make teas, brandy, liquors, that could be used for pleasure, community sharing and sociality, but could also be used to treat disease. For example, juniper bark is one of the prevalent trees in the Great Dismal Swamp, kinds of species of trees. And the juniper roots, the tree roots, are perpetually submerged underwater. They can create a kind of healing tonic against malaria. And one rare account of maroon life, which is recorded by two Norfolk merchants, Atchison and Parker are their names. And they're there in the swamp because they're interested in the wood industry that is attempting to burgeon. And they want to exchange and extract wood products like wooden shingles, cedar shingles, and clapboards out of the swamp. A lot of this work was done by enslaved labor. But the merchants are there in the swamp for that reason, which is a capitalist reason. And they described, upon this venture of theirs, a Negro man ran away from his master, who they encountered, who for 13 years, and this is in their ledger of their economic dealings, who for 13 years had been in the swamp, raised rice and other grain, and made chairs, tables, and musical instruments. The musical instruments would have been likely made from the very cypress, gum, or juniper or pine trees that the merchants were there to extract and exploit as capital. But maroons, conversely, arranged and rearranged the swamp's natural resources toward emancipatory, fugitive ends. Maroon knowledge of the swamp's bounty and healing properties afforded Black mutual aid, it afforded community against death, against recapture, just as the sharing of food that they were raising and cultivating and the supplies that they were able to manufacture with their own ingenuity that were natural to this swamp provided the very currency for forms of insurgent Black social life. This is an 1888 illustration of maroons in the swamp. Maroons also, in addition to the ways that they sustained social life, they also arranged the insurgent ecology by invigorating the swamp as a retreat for secreting information and plotting. Active plotting, active planning, active strategy, concealing weapons, encouraging physical attacks and revolt against the outside world who would otherwise, without some of these plans, enslave them without question. One group of maroons who had for a long time been depredating upon the property of the good citizens of Edenton, this is directly from one of the surviving records about a smaller maroon group, 1819. They were discovered to have been living in the swamp, and that's why I'm showing you this tree. They were living, quote, in a hollow gum tree sufficiently large to contain 6 persons with much comfort. Now, this person's name was Jack Stump. He was a notorious maroon, but upon his discovery, Jack Stump died in the exchange of gunfire, but not before he fired twice and was in the act of loading again. I know I'm running out of time, so I wanted to show you some of the raised areas, some of the drier areas that were quite habitable and inviting for sustained evasion and alternative lifeways in this swamp. I talked about plots, I talked about revolt. It's important to really think about the ways that maroons were not altogether apathetic to what's going on in the outside world, and were deeply interested in continued struggle as slavery persists. So you have this really famous case of the Easter Rebellion, which involved runaways, so-called, in the swamp. And this is an ad that does make mention of the fact that it was greatly feared and believed that large companies of runaway slaves were armed in the Great Swamp near the Virginia line, as you might be able to see at the bottom of this. Negroes again troublesome. So in this 1802 rebellion, which is really an offshoot of Gabriel Prosser's earlier, 2 years previous attempted rebellion to take the city of Richmond and liberate the state of Virginia, followers of Prosser continue with the plotting and planning. And maroons become involved in this, maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp. One such famous maroon is that of Tom Copper, who you can see, this is an account that appeared in the Norfolk Herald. The end of the account, you see Charles Grice, who's the militia captain. This fellow, we are told, had a camp in one of the swamps and is outlawed. More evidence of maroon involvement and leadership and the use of this swamp and this insurgent ecology to advance these plans. Okay, how am I Okay. I guess I'll stop, but I really wanted to get to women. I mean, I feel that this is the work I'm doing now is really what are women Maroons doing? How are they involved in these designs and plans? How are they using space? This is just one example, and I guess I'll just end with this, where you can see that the report is left by those who were hunters and were scouring this, a certain pocket of the swamp outside of Edenton, North Carolina. And they came across a so-called Negro camp, which contained, quoting here, 5 runaway Negroes, 2 wenches, and 3 fellows who are armed. Later in the account, it says that the wenches were both taken. It says that they had bid defiance to any force whatever and were resolved to stand their ground. And while we don't get much about who these women were, we certainly don't get their names. We do get some of the male Maroons named, who were in fact captured. One person escapes, but there's a scene of combat. And are we to imagine that the 2 so-called wenches stood by without a care, stood by without any active involvement in this moment of danger, capture, knowing that women, Black women, enslaved women, were the most vulnerable group in the slaveholding South? They would have known exactly the gendered, sexed, and raced fates that would have they would have had to have faced, that would have come with capture and the danger of capture. So they would have known more than anyone how dangerous this moment would be and would have had the greatest stakes in an interest in fight, in an interest in holding and standing their ground. So I will leave you with that. And I look forward to further conversation. I had planned a little bit more, but I'm sure we can talk about it together. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you so much, Kathryn, for sharing that. We're looking forward to kind of hearing more from you. So feel free to share more, weave in maybe what you weren't able to get to in our discussion. So what we'll do now is we'll turn over the floor to our moderator, Dr. White and Dr. Benjamin Golden, who will have a bit of a discussion first before we open it up to you all for Q&A. And so we'll let these 2 start. I can, pass off this mic, and we look forward to the rich conversation.
Thank you.
Hello. Okay. Thank you so much, Melanie. And thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin Golden, for that incredible talk. I just want to reiterate how much of an honor it is to have you here presenting your work at Georgetown and how special it is to have Kara Walker's art as a backdrop. And, I was especially, thinking about the connections between your work and this very piece behind us, which I think, speaks to a lot of the kind of gendered histories of marronage or unearthing. And, it speaks to, depending on your perspective, the kind of dangers but immense possibilities that, the natural landscape and environment presented to enslaved folks and maroons in the Great Dismal Swamp. So it's just really incredible to have that as a backdrop. And I just also want to begin by saying what a tremendous contribution your work makes to such a kind of site-specific study of maroon world making. So you're bringing out such rich textures of the Great Dismal Swamp in particular, and you're doing so by deeply accounting for the gendered contours of maroon world making. And, I know you didn't get to kind of go into that part in your talk, but that's actually the question I wanted to start with, if you could walk us back to sort of the inception of your project, in its conception from its very beginning, why was it important to you to sort of center the stories and experiences of maroon women? Yeah.
Thank you. I really deeply appreciate that question. It's a wonderful place to start. Mm-hmm. I am responsive to omission, silence, what is most neglected. And when you begin with women, you won't be able to leave out other actors in the unfolding of this history. You won't be able to leave out or neglect in your interpretation of this place, but also of its human actors, children who are tied to women in ways that they are not tied to men, particularly in this moment, in this historical moment. But you're also able to ask a series of intersectional questions that, for me, are inspired by Black feminist thought and theory. And I use this really as a methodology. But what that means for me is that there is a central priority that women are considered wherever they appear in the assortment and of varied and distinct written records that surround the history of this swamp. Wherever they appear, I must assume the full humanity of women. So beginning with that assumption and that question and that value is how I'm guided to what I consider a moral calling and imperative to look deeper and look underneath and look behind for women who are appearing, while it is a challenge and it is a deep one, to know more about them. And I'm so glad to know and hear that you've been teaching, right? And I know your students are here, Jennifer Morgan's work, and she really is just very clear. We weren't supposed to know this. We aren't supposed to even be able to ask this question, and yet we're still going to ask it, and we will ask the questions and frame our telling or frame our interpretation around questions and what was possible. And what we know about Black women, what we know about human beings, what we know about the historical context. And also, how can we think and look for their knowledges, their perspectives, truths, but their intellectual work, their political work, which is evident within the decision in and of itself to live in a maroon in marronage, to live in a kind of evasion, to live in a kind of fugitive, outlawed culture. You are a criminal if you are a maroon, and a woman that decides, this is the life for me. I will live amongst armed men, because all the maroon women I have encountered are outnumbered, all of them. But the decision to live amongst people who are called outlaws, as we just saw, who are called banditti, who are called gangs of desperados, women in the 19th century and the 18th century who elect a world on the run, a life on the run. That is we got to peel back the layers around the intentionality there, the consciousness, the decisions that women are making about the future of their wombs, the future of their reproductive labor, their productive labor, the lives of their children. And those questions haven't really been asked specific to this place. But I think, and we're seeing more of this with Jennifer Morgan's work. She has an entire chapter in her most recent book, right, around where are women maroons. We know not all maroons are men. Crystal Eden's work as well, which is asking us to think about the reproductive justice work that maroon women are doing by mothering and choosing to mother in what they consider safe places in the wilderness across the Americas. So those are some of the reasons. And again, we can't ignore, I can't ignore the place of women where they do appear next to and alongside. And there are many examples of that, but I will, the two women at Snaky Swamp, which I just shared with you, but there's a really famous maroon man, his name is Bob Farabee, and every scholar of the Dismal Swamp, and there are 3, okay? But every scholar will, it's a given that you're gonna explore Bob Farabee, who was at large for 6 years and was, there's multiple newspaper reports, and this is news. I mean, this is the 19th century news. This is 1823. He's at large at 1818, I think, first. None of these newspaper accounts mention the presence of a woman in their maroon band. But upon deeper looking, and I just looked at records that my colleagues had not looked at. And there in a deposition was a woman described as Maria, who was a wife of Nelson, who was the partner or one of these male maroons. And what's interesting is that Maria was described as being the one who went to the fence after Bob Farabee had shot a white man named David Manning, who was encroaching upon them and trying to, hunt them down and find them. And he, in defense, shoots the David Manning. And so as a result, the next day, Maria is the one that goes to the fence of a nearby plantation and gets intelligence and brings intelligence back. So these are the hidden and shadowed ways that Maroon women were actually really involved and active in sustaining their lifeways as Maroons at the borderlands. And so I just think that is a tremendous finding, and there may be very well more, but it does require a kind of different questions. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I was really struck by your framing of Maroon women's sort of labor of care as reproductive justice. That's something that my students and I have been exploring in class. And so especially thinking about, self-possession and what that means for Maroon women in particular to repossess their bodies, their reproductive capacity, their wombs, their kinship ties, their motherhood. So that's deeply, deeply powerful. And, you mentioned how, kind of uncovering those histories and stories requires a sort of deeper digging or looking elsewhere and asking otherwise. And so that brings us to the question of your methodology. I know you sort of mentioned that in your work you look at written and unwritten sources, and that includes sort of going to the space. So you showed us, a series of photographs. And so I'm really interested in kind of hearing more about your methodology and like your own embodied practice and sort of approaching your work. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was, as I was sharing with the seminar earlier, my work took a real turn when I went to this place. It's one thing to read these accounts. It's one thing to understand the colonial and enslaving perspective of this space, which is really negative and annoyed and frustrated. And it's one thing to sort of get why that might be with the specific descriptions of, thick and dense foliage and the untamability of it, which is really conveyed in a series of records. However, going there made me really experience myself. So the embodiment part of your question, there was no way that I couldn't fully experience what it meant, what it must have meant sensorially to those who navigated this place and, moved through it, or what it sounds like. And again, this swamp in this moment is 10% of what it was in 1810, because there's been years of draining and canal digging and now transportation through its canals. So it is not even 90% of what it was, and yet the intensity of it remains, and you feel the insurgent potential. I struggle to put words to this, and I've written about the ways in which some of this defies articulation, and I think that's also part of why the ecology, the environmental framework is so important. There is something, spiritual is a way that I might describe this, where you can sense those that were there, where you can feel the energy, which, we understand that energy is never created or destroyed, and it lingers. But the potential there for a kind of subversion is readable, sensible. But that's one aspect of my embodied experience there. The other is just, I agree with the colonists. I mean, it's a very difficult place. I agree with it in that respect. I agree with them in that respect. I mean, it's a really challenging place. It is very challenging. And as I was explaining earlier, I was walking through this place with fish waders on that were, mid-thigh and, gear. And the enslaved and these maroons were not. And that is a record. That is something that has a tremendous value as I endeavor to understand what it means to have marooned there and made these series of decisions to choose a swamp as the place that you would like to envision your future and would like to remain for any given number of time, or for any given amount of time or length of time. So I think those were really important lessons to me, and I began to understand the space itself as a record, as an archive. And yes, an unwritten archive, one that is alive, but one, as I began to speak about, right, is one of the three sort of forces or actors in the telling of any kind of social historical narrative about this place. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And speaking of the Great Dismal Swamp as a living archive, in the sake of time, I have one more question for you, but I'm going to combine it. So I'm really interested in turning to the contemporary, right? And thinking about, the descendants of maroons from the region, right? And if your work has engaged descendants in any capacity. So that's the first part of the question. Yeah. The second part of the question is really critical to the Mellon Sawyer Seminar series, especially in thinking about, placemaking, restorative ecologies, and spatial futures. And that question is, where do you see Black people in the future, right? And how does your work help you answer that question?
Okay, I'm gonna try to be brief. I know that was a lot. No, the second question, I really want to give some care to that. Okay, so the first question is about descendants. I will just briefly say then with this. Yes, I would say a half of the energy I poured into my dissertation was about the present swamp and descendant knowledges, continued lifeways that are agrarian, that are that use and see this swamp as a space of sustenance and a space that aids Black life and Black future even now, became evident in my conversations. I spoke with 30 descendants of enslaved people. They do not identify as descendants of maroons. I've never found a descendant of a maroon from Virginia, North Carolina. But I have certainly found people who are descendants of the enslaved locally around this Tidewater region who, and I interviewed and I worked with and thought with elders who knew people. And so there are a handful of stories that are, again, precious that came through my dialogue with local communities, which would never have been documented. Stories around, there was one woman who was in her 70s when I interviewed her in 2015 and spoke with her in 2015, and she described someone she knew who was born in, I believe it was her uncle, who was born in 1857, and told her as a child about how they used to breathe out of reeds in the Dismal Swamp when patrollers were coming. They would submerge themselves and use a reed. Now, that would have never been something that you would have found in any of the written records that I have. There's a place for that oral account in my work. And the reed becomes a text. Okay, but I would go back to the second question. This question deserves a lot of attention. But I guess quickly I would say I'm an optimist, and yet when I think about Black futures, there's a level and a pull to be brutally real and bordering pessimist. And I really hate to say that. But what I mean by that is when I look around the world now and we see the same colonial logics around borders over people and genocide, we're seeing violence, we're seeing exclusion. And I also have to reckon with the fact that people of color, women, Black people are those communities that tend to be most, they're going to suffer the worst in a pandemic. They're going to suffer the worst with climate change, with gentrification. And so I think that when I think about the future, Black people are going to continue to be in motion. And you ask where, but I wonder if we can think about movement as a place, movement as a location, because certainly this history asks us to do that, that there might be something in the actual process of flight or in the actual process of leaving, saying, making a firm stance, I must be away. That might be a location where it is freer than just remaining put. So I wonder if we can think about that. But I think Black people are going to be right here. They're going to be everywhere. And I think that they're going to be continuing to move, but also to world make. And a value of Maranaj as a figure of thought, as a principle maybe, is the ways in which we might think about worlds of joy. Where are these places? Worlds of rest. Where are these places that Black people are mapping right now? Worlds of even sonic spaces, spaces where you can retreat into a kind of sound or music. We can think about retreat and apply it in those ways. And as well as we can think about continued movement making. And Maroons encourage us to do that too. So I would leave it with that, but we are in the future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin Goldman. That is an excellent place to end, and it speaks to, the kind of trans-historical contemporary impact of your work. So thank you so much, and let's give Dr. Golden another round of applause. We do have time, about 5 or so minutes for some questions. Okay, so actually we have about 10 minutes for questions. So I want to open it up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions? Okay.
Hand for that? Are you first?
Yeah, my name is Mel. I just want to know specifically. Oh, thank you, appreciate it. Specifically, I would imagine the main reason for locations in the swamp because there was less of a trail, say, like for the dogs and stuff like that. Like, what exactly were the difficulties? I mean, I know you mentioned there were, but what specifically were the real difficulties where they said, okay, we're going to turn back now, like that would secure their location?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. And of course, there's a limit of all the frames in my images. There's a limit. You can't really understand the whole world that this swamp is. The limits are getting lost. The limits are the inability to even see the sky at certain points in this swamp because of the density. They are the depth as well as water. So before draining, sometimes, and Moses Grandy's narrative has really helped us to think about how much more intense the swamp space was before draining. He describes enslaved canal laborers who were principally boys and men who were hired to hand dig out these canals. But they describe, and he was one of such person. He describes sometimes the men and boys being completely submerged underwater as they're hand digging out the water in order to create really a channel of commerce. So that's a lot of water to maneuver. That's a challenge. And so what all that tells me is that Maroons, enslaved people really studied the land. They really studied space. And when they came into knowledge of an avenue in, the swamp is foreboding. I mean, there's no way you can ignore it. So people who are confined to the plantation spaces and farms as enslaved people, they're very aware of the natural world around them. And the fact that the swamp is right there, the fact that there are rivers and waterways, streams that lead into it that might open up an opportunity to access it or access particular places, they were learned and deeply studied around how to maneuver this. But it's a challenge for those who have less investment in doing so, who are typically enslaving people, who didn't want to be bothered with it at all. It's a space of refuse and waste if it can't be controlled. And you can see the ways in which some of these markets for wood products do end up doing a little bit of taming of the swamp. I mean, or at least extracting and I would say not taming, but extracting and making it navigable for capitalist reasons. But those are some reasons. I mean, those are some ways that it's challenging. There's also the water's black. And so you can't see the bottom. And so if you're walking, and I'm speaking from personal experience, there's vines and roots underneath and tree roots. You can trip. You can't see. The challenges are things like poisonous snakes. The challenges are things like swarms of mosquitoes. All of these things, maroons found ways to remedy, like smoke that deters noxious insects. And of course, pathways that become learned and studied. So yeah, so those are some of the natural, I think, challenges. But there are more opportunities for life than there are challenges from the enslaved perspective, from Black people's perspective. Okay.
Well, yeah, back there. There's a mic. There's a microphone.
Oh, June and July. Yeah. Wow. Wow. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And it's true. And I've never seen a swarm of mosquitoes. I mean, you may see one or two, but a swarm, and that was real in 2015, in 2013. But yeah, stories like that are fiercely protected by descendant communities around, an ancestor lived or moved through this swamp. And what I did find, though, when I was speaking to some descendant communities, is that in the period, the mid 20th century, there's a reluctance to associate oneself as a Black person with a swamp in a moment that you're trying to be fully included in a segregated society. To associate yourself or your people with a swamp led to a lot of silence around, and not pride around, this kind of relationship with this place. But there are rare and precious stories that come out like you've just shared. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a master's student here at Georgetown University. I'm curious, you mentioned you weren't able to come in contact with any descendants of the maroon community. Why is that?
Well, I think it's partly of what I just said around a kind of generational reluctance to share about coming from people who ran from slavery. I mean, a lot of people don't want to talk about slavery at all. And I found that to be pretty prevalent in descendant communities of enslaved people, where it's uncomfortable. And partly because we're still living in the aftermath of it. But what happens in this community, in the Dismal Swamp, is that most maroons leave and want to blend in or move through society as citizens after the Civil War. So there is no retained surviving maroon community like you have in Jamaica, where you have, hundreds of maroons alone on one side of the island right now. And there are 4 surviving maroon communities that maintain land rights by their own continued fight. That doesn't exist in this country, and partly because of the particularity of United States history and the unfolding of slavery into the Reconstruction, which is a very different history than the colonial history of Jamaica or Suriname, where these maroons still are there. But that's not the case here. You might see maroon descendants in a place like Oklahoma, because a lot of Black Seminoles who are maroons and the Creeks and other indigenous groups, Seminoles, who were forcibly relocated by Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears into Oklahoma, they are descendants of maroons. So there's a kind of, there's still a claim of that there, but that didn't happen in Virginia. There aren't there's no visible maroon community at this point. Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry. I promise I thought of my question as you were speaking, but I'm nervous, so I kind of lost it. So my question is, given what we know about Black environmental knowledge and maroon communities and our relationship with agriculture, can something be said about the recent movement or social movements of Black people like returning to nature, like recreationally or with homesteading? Like that's part of my research, so I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think that I actually have a student that is interested in learning about the histories of marronage as entry points to lessons around Black farming, Black relationships with, nature, soaking up the sun, gardening. I mean, these are things that Black people have done across time. This is not new. You can think about people, there's a woman named Augusta Savage. She was a sculptor associated with the Harlem Renaissance, and she gets started with her art by putting her hands in the red clay of Florida. So these, the Alice Walker and thinking about gardening, and Zora Neale Hurston's work, Janie under the pear tree. I mean, these are deep relationships that Black people have had across time with nature, and it's been articulated and expressed in a variety of ways. But certainly the Maroons are also telling us that in addition to those kinds of ways of being free in a moment or being tapped in and one with nature, and that gives people energy and rest and recovery in this world. Nature also serves in other ways that can be more overtly resistant, that can create whole new alternative avenues of life against this system of racial capitalism. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned, but Fannie Lou Hamer and Freedom Farming Cooperative, there's a lot of that energy around Black control of land and our own food in the midst of food deserts. I mean, these are things that Maroons and their plot, the plots that the colonists destroyed when they encroach upon Maroon communities throughout, that plot I think resonates with a lot of those imperatives that we have to feed ourselves, and we need community control or autonomy to some extent around our wellness, right? I think that there's parallels there. I appreciate that question. I saw you though, and I know I might be called, but she had been raising her hand. Yes, no, you, in the plaid, yes. Oh, okay.
Hi, our last question. Okay. My question was just a little bit about how you touched on earlier about like the energy that you felt in this space, like when you visited yourself. And I'm really curious if you could talk a little bit more about like the emotional or spiritual connection that you felt yourself in there or lack thereof.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. We take that for granted sometimes, too much. Well, it was challenging because I'm going into this space in a team of archaeologists, 95% of whom did not share African ancestry, and we are digging it up. But this was someone's home. And again, this was where people gave birth and buried their elders. And so there is a way that we're disrupting that space. And I had to really sit with that. I knew the dig was going to happen anyway, but there's a level of respect, and I really felt called to offer that. And I might have been the quietest person because I really recognized how sacred the space is. I mean, the space continues to be a space that it's considered sacred, even to people who, again, don't claim that they are descendant of Maroons, but who are local Black folks that understand what happened here. And they understand the kind of power that this space emanates, and the stories that have yet to be told and are now being told or made more visible. But there's a way that some of the non-human life in this place you kind of sense that that all of like the trees remember, the water remembers. And so that's something that is part of what I mentioned earlier. I don't know how really to articulate, but there is a kind of linked spiritual import with this place that I'm sure enslaved people and maroons that were in the space also felt as they listened to. I mean, signs are really important. Reading these narratives that enslaved people, fugitive slave narratives. Solomon Bailey is one, and he talks about on the run, listening to buzzards and seeing buzzards suddenly appear and deciding to read it as a message, and then hiding, and then lo and behold, here comes some slave catchers. So there's a way that places and Black people have been really connected to reading messages and the spiritual import of water and woods and non-human animals that they might read and interpret. And I think I also was beginning to feel that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin Golden. One more round of applause.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to say thank you one more time to Dr. White, Dr. Benjamin Golden, and to all of you, as well as to the Georgetown Art Galleries for partnering with us for this phenomenal event. We want to now open the gallery to you again for you to take in this body of work, but also to move out into the foyer where we have a reception with some appetizers and wine. We have about 45-ish minutes, so feel free to mingle, continue the conversation, and appreciate the art. Thank you again so much for coming out.